Anthony and Matilda were buzzing with excitement as they packed their bags for the upcoming trip. Their best friends, Alex and Tonia, were finally tying the knot, and the traditional wedding was to take place in Tonia's ancestral village of Eerie. Tonia had always been reluctant to talk about her hometown. She preferred the hustle and bustle of the city, where modern life drowned out the whispers of the past. Whenever Alex brought up the idea of visiting, she would shake her head and say, "There's nothing there but old people and superstitions." But Alex was an adventurer at heart. "How bad can it get?" he had joked repeatedly, eager to experience the rich culture Tonia kept hidden from him. In the end, his curiosity won. Tonia, albeit begrudgingly, agreed to host the traditional wedding in Eerie. Matilda, on the other hand, was thrilled about the idea. Eerie sounds fascinating, a place steeped in tradition and folklore, she said excitedly as she folded a bright Ankara dress into her suitcase. "This will be an experience, Anthony." Anthony grunted in response, adjusting his glasses as he scrolled through his phone. Unlike his wife, he wasn't eager about spending too much money on a trip he considered unnecessary. He loved his friends, but spending lavishly on travel accommodations wasn't his style. After scouring the internet for options, he had quietly booked the cheapest Airbnb he could find in Eerie without telling Matilda. It wasn't much, just a tiny rundown bungalow on the outskirts of the village, but in Anthony's eyes, it was perfect at half the price of the other options. It suited his frugal nature perfectly. Matilda, oblivious to Anthony's penny-pinching antics, nudged him. "I can't wait to see what Tonia's hometown is like." She always avoids the topic. Anthony chuckled nervously. "Yeah, well, I'm sure it's charming in its own way." A couple of days before the wedding, Anthony and Matilda set off for Eerie. Rather than paying for a flight like the rest of their friends had, Anthony, ever the penny pincher, decided to save money and travel by road using a public transport. Matilda, though exhausted by the idea of the long, uncomfortable journey, kept her thoughts to herself. She had known Anthony long enough to know that arguing over his choices was futile. The journey, as expected, was anything but smooth. The bus was cramped, and the hours seemed to stretch on endlessly as they bumped along narrow, winding roads. The heat was unbearable, and the stale air made Matilda's skin feel sticky. Anthony, however, seemed to relish in the discomfort, pointing out landmarks and chatting with fellow passengers, oblivious to Matilda's mounting frustration. "This is what real adventure feels like," Anthony exclaimed, grinning widely. Matilda rolled her eyes, leaning back in her seat with a sigh. "Sure, if you like misery." By the time they reached their destination, it was well past midnight. The village was shrouded in darkness, and the narrow roads seemed eerily silent. There were no streetlights, and the only illumination came from the occasional flicker of a distant bonfire or the glow of a candle in a window. "We're here," Anthony said, pointing out the window. "Eerie." Matilda gazed out, her exhaustion and discomfort mixing with a sense of foreboding. The village, though beautiful in its own way, felt unsettling. It was as if time had stopped here, and the weight of generations past hung in the air. After disembarking, they hailed a local motorcycle taxi to take them to the bungalow. The roads were too narrow for cars, and the motorbike wove through the dark streets with ease. By the time they arrived at their accommodation, the area seemed to grow even more quiet, as though the village itself was holding its breath. "Is this where we're going to be staying?" Matilda asked, eyeing the bungalow again as they stepped off the bike. Anthony didn't respond immediately. He was too busy fumbling with his wallet, handing the driver the fare before hurriedly walking to the door. Inside, the musty air greeted them, and Matilda immediately opened the window to let in some air. The small room felt stifling, with a lingering scent of old wood and earth. Scary sculptures and animal head skeleton hung on the wall as decorations. She threw her bag on the bed with a sigh. "I can't believe we're staying here." Anthony nodded but didn't say anything, too tired to argue or even acknowledge her discomfort. They had traveled all day and were both physically drained. Matilda couldn't help but glance around the room uneasily. The walls felt like they were closing in on her. The shadows seemed deeper in the corners, and the flickering light cast strange shapes that twisted in the dark. She shivered involuntarily, but decided to shake it off. "I just need to sleep." They both quickly undressed and climbed into bed. the creaking sounds of the wooden floorboards adding to the strange atmosphere. After a while, Anthony's steady breathing indicated that he had fallen asleep. Matilda, however, tossed and turned, unable to find any comfort in the unfamiliar setting. The room seemed to breathe with them. Every small noise, every creak and crack, sounded amplified. There was a muffled sound from outside, like someone whispering just out of earshot. But when Matilda looked, there was no one there. Her heart raced, and she pulled the blanket tighter around her, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. She glanced over at Anthony, who lay on his back, snoring lightly, oblivious to the strangeness of the room. But Matilda couldn't let go of the nagging sense that something was wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, like an invisible presence watching her. The longer she lay awake, the more intense it became. Suddenly, the floorboard beneath her shifted, the wood groaning in a way that seemed unnatural. Matilda's eyes shot open, her breath catching in her throat. She could swear she heard the faintest whisper, soft and melodic, like a lullaby coming from the far corner of the room. She bolted upright, her eyes scanning the shadows. "Anthony," she whispered, shaking him. "Anthony, wake up." He grumbled but didn't wake up. She shook him harder. "Anthony." This time he groggily opened his eyes, blinking in confusion. "What? What is it?" "Did you hear that?" Matilda asked, her voice low, almost trembling. "Hear what?" Anthony muttered, rubbing his eyes and looking around the room. "The whispering," she said, her voice quivering. "It's like someone's here." Anthony sighed, clearly annoyed at being woken up in the middle of the night. "You're imagining things, Matilda. We've been on the road for hours. Just relax, okay?" Matilda wasn't convinced, but seeing that Anthony was now sound asleep again, she lay back down, though her body remained tense, her eyes wide open. Then she saw it. A shadowy figure raising its hands above her. Her heart pounded as she slowly peeked out from under the blanket. Standing at the foot of the bed was a very old, creepy-looking elderly woman. Her wrinkled face was ghostly pale, and her wide, unsettling smile revealed a set of blackened teeth. Her eyes, dark and sunken, seemed to pierce right through Matilda. Matilda let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the small bungalow, jolting Anthony awake. He sat up groggily, his eyes widening in horror as he saw the eerie figure. Without thinking, he scrambled out of bed and clung to Matilda, his face buried in her shoulder. "Oh my God. Who are you?" he stammered, his voice trembling. The old woman didn't flinch. Instead, she let out a soft chuckle, the sound sending shivers down their spines. "Ah, you two must be the guests," she said in a raspy voice, tilting her head slightly. "I am Madame Ebun. I own this house. I just came to welcome you." Matilda and Anthony exchanged terrified glances, their hands clutching each other tightly. They both stood up slowly, their legs shaky beneath them, never taking their eyes off the strange woman. Madame Ebun's smile never faltered. "Didn't mean to scare you," she continued, stepping closer. The floor creaked under her bare feet. "I always welcome my guests personally. It's a tradition." Matilda swallowed hard, forcing herself to nod. Thank you," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. Anthony, his voice hoarse with fear, managed a weak smile. Yes, thank you, Mom." Madame Ebon's eyes flicked between them, and she let out another dry chuckle. "You city folks are always so nervous," she mused. "No need to be afraid. This house, it has a lot of history." Matilda felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She didn't dare ask what kind of history the house had. Instead, she nodded furiously, her lips pressed tightly together. "Are you comfortable?" Madame Ebon asked, her smile widening, revealing even more of her blackened teeth. "The house takes getting used to." Anthony could barely form a coherent response. Yes, very comfortable," he blurted out, despite the obvious sweat trickling down his forehead. Madame Ebon nodded approvingly. Good. I'll let you rest then." After she left, Anthony and Matilda couldn't close their eyes even for a bit. The eerie presence of the old woman lingered in the air, and every creak of the wooden house sent shivers down their spines. Anthony paced nervously by the window, occasionally glancing outside into the pitch-black night. "We have to find another place, Matilda," he whispered urgently. "I don't care if we have to sleep outside. We can't stay here." Matilda nodded, hugging herself tightly. "But it's already so late, Anthony. We don't even have a signal to call Alex or Tonia. And what if—" A sudden scraping noise echoed through the stillness of the night, a sharp metallic sound. It was unmistakable, the sound of knives being sharpened. Matilda gasped and clutched Anthony's arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Anthony put a finger to his lips and tiptoed to the door. There was a small crack near the frame, just enough for him to peek through without being noticed. What he saw on the other side made his blood run cold. A group of creepy-looking elderly villagers, their faces shadowed and gaunt, stood in the dimly lit courtyard. They held rusted knives and old chipped plates, murmuring in low tones. Their eyes gleamed unnaturally under the flickering lantern light as they appeared to be preparing for something. One of them, a haggard-looking man with hollow cheeks, ran his fingers along the edge of his blade, smiling eerily. Anthony's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded violently against his ribs as he slowly backed away from the door. "Matilda," he whispered, his face pale with fear, "we need to leave. Now." Matilda's eyes widened. "What? What did you see?" No time to explain. He grabbed her hand and dragged her toward the window. He fumbled with the rusted latch, his sweaty fingers slipping, but after a few frantic tries, it creaked open. With one last glance at the door, Anthony helped Matilda climb out first. She landed softly on the ground outside, and he quickly followed, pulling the window shut behind them as quietly as possible. The night air was thick and humid, and the village was eerily silent apart from the occasional rustling of leaves. Without a second thought, they bolted into the darkness, running as fast as their legs could carry them. Matilda stumbled over the uneven ground, her breath ragged. "Anthony, where are we going?" she panted, barely able to keep up. "Anywhere but here," Anthony gasped, glancing back over his shoulder, half expecting to see the villagers chasing after them. They ran through the narrow dirt paths, past huts and dense clusters of trees, their surroundings growing more unfamiliar by the second. Twigs snapped beneath their feet, and the shadows of towering trees seemed to close in around them. After what felt like an eternity, they finally stopped at the foot of an iroko tree. Anthony bent over, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. We should be safe here for now." Matilda clutched his arm, tears in her eyes. "Anthony, what is happening? Who were those people?" Anthony swallowed hard, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I don't know, but they looked like they were preparing to eat us." Matilda hugged herself, trembling. "We left everything behind. Our bags, our phones." "I took my phone with me," Anthony said, patting his pocket. "We'll try and get to a place with network service tomorrow and hopefully call Alex to come and get us." As he was talking, a rustling sound caught Matilda's attention. She turned her head slowly and her eyes widened in horror. A snake, its dark scales glistening in the moonlight, slithered silently beside her, its forked tongue flicking out menacingly. Before she could react, Anthony saw it too and panicked. "Matilda, run!" he shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her away from the snake. They stumbled through the underbrush, tripping over roots and rocks in their haste to put as much distance between themselves and the creature as possible. Once they were far enough away, Matilda collapsed onto a patch of grass, her chest heaving. This is insane, Anthony," she cried. "First that creepy old woman, then those people with the knives, and now a snake. What else could go wrong?" Anthony wiped the sweat off his brow, his heart still racing. "I'm sorry, Matilda," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I should have listened to you. I should have booked a proper hotel. I was just trying to save some money." Matilda shot him a sharp look, tears welling up in her eyes. "Save money? Look where that's gotten us, Anthony. We're stranded in the middle of nowhere, with God knows what lurking around us. I can't believe you put us in this situation." Anthony sighed, his shoulders slumping. "You're right. I messed up. I should have prioritized our safety instead of being so cheap. If we make it out of this, I promise, I'll put you first. No more cutting corners, I swear." Matilda sniffled, hugging herself tightly. "I just want to get out of here. I don't care how much it costs." They sat there in silence, too afraid to sleep, their eyes darting around at every rustle of the leaves and distant howl in the night. The hours dragged on painfully slowly, and every minute felt like an eternity. Anthony checked his phone every so often, hoping for even a single bar of network, but the screen remained stubbornly blank. He cursed under his breath, shaking the device in frustration. As the first faint rays of dawn began to peek through the trees, Matilda finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's almost morning. What do we do now?" Anthony stood up, stretching his stiff limbs. "We'll head toward the main road, find some service, and call Alex. We'll explain everything and get the hell out of this place." Matilda nodded, standing up beside him. "And if we run into anyone from the village?" Anthony's jaw tightened. "We'll just keep walking. No talking, no looking back." With that, they began their cautious trek back toward what they hoped was safety, the weight of the previous night still heavy on their minds. After some time, they finally managed to get enough network signal and quickly sent their live location to Alex and Tonia, pleading with them to come and pick them up as soon as possible. Exhausted and still shaken from the night's ordeal, Anthony and Matilda sat on the side of the dusty road, anxiously waiting for their friends to arrive. Every rustle of leaves and distant sound made them flinch, their paranoia still fresh. When Alex and Tonia's car finally pulled up, relief washed over them. But as their friends stepped out and took a closer look at them, their expressions turned from concern to shock. "Jesus Christ, what happened to you guys?" Alex exclaimed, rushing to help Matilda to her feet. Matilda glanced down at herself and gasped. Their clothes were torn and tattered, and their bodies were covered in bruises and scratches they hadn't even noticed in the darkness. Anthony, looking equally disheveled, avoided their gaze, embarrassed and shaken. We were almost turned to food," Matilda stammered, her voice trembling. "We just had to get out of there." "Get out of where?" Tonia asked, her brows furrowing. "That Airbnb," Anthony muttered, rubbing his forehead. Something wasn't right about it. I heard them planning to cooking and eating us. Alex exchanged a worried look with Tonia. "Get in the car. We're taking you guys to the police." Despite their exhaustion, they agreed. They needed answers, closure. At the police station, Anthony and Matilda recounted their terrifying experience to the officers, leaving out no detail. The eerie old woman, the strange villagers with knives, it all sounded too bizarre to be real. The officers, however, didn't look surprised. One of the officers, an older man with a serious expression, nodded solemnly. "This isn't the first time we've heard of something like this," he said. "That location, it's been reported before." Matilda's eyes widened. "What do you mean? Reported for what?" "Ghost sightings," the officer replied. "Several people have complained about strange occurrences in that area. They say a house appears there every full moon, and those who stay in it, well, they don't stay for long." Anthony felt a chill run down his spine. "So you're saying it was a ghost house?" The officer shrugged. "Some say it's cursed land. Others believe it's the spirits of villagers who died there long ago. Either way, the house isn't supposed to exist." Alex leaned in. "So, what now?" "We'll go check it out," the officer said, grabbing his radio. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Anthony and Matilda, still shaken but curious, agreed to accompany the officers, with Alex and Tonia joining them. They drove back to the eerie location where Anthony and Matilda had spent the night. But when they arrived, their jaws dropped. The house was gone. The plot of land where it had stood was now an empty field, covered in overgrown grass and scattered debris. No sign of the bungalow, no sign of Madame Eben. It was as if the entire place had never existed. Matilda clutched Anthony's arm. I don't understand," she whispered. One of the villagers passing by noticed them and approached. "You people went there?" the elderly man asked, shaking his head in dismay. "You're lucky you made it out." "What do you mean?" Alex asked. The man sighed heavily. "People have disappeared there before. They say it's haunted by restless spirits looking for company. You must be careful in Eerie. Not everything here is what it seems." The officers, realizing there was nothing more they could do, wrapped up their investigation. Luckily, Anthony and Matilda's bags and belongings were found scattered near the site, though their clothes were damp and their items slightly damaged. Still reeling from the night's events, Anthony didn't hesitate this time. He booked the most expensive hotel in the area. As they checked into the luxurious suite, Matilda sank onto the plush bed, finally feeling a sense of security. Anthony sat beside her, holding her hand. "I promise, Matilda, no more cheap things. Never again." She looked at him, exhaustion in her eyes, but a small smile on her lips. "You better keep that promise." As they finally drifted off to sleep, the lingering question remained in their minds. What exactly had they encountered in that house? The next morning, despite their lingering fear and exhaustion, Anthony and Matilda prepared themselves for Alex and Tonia's wedding. The elegant event was set against the beautiful backdrop of Eerie village, blending modern elegance with rich cultural traditions. Tonia, resplendent in her traditional attire, beamed with happiness, while Alex couldn't take his eyes off her. Anthony and Matilda, though still shaken from their ordeal, managed to put on a brave face and enjoy the festivities. The vibrant music, the colorful fabrics, and the joyous dances helped them momentarily forget the horror of the previous night. "Are you guys okay now?" Tonia asked them during a quiet moment. Anthony forced a smile. "Yeah, we're just glad we made it to see you two get married." Matilda nodded, squeezing Anthony's hand. It was worth it. After a successful wedding filled with laughter and love, they all packed up and flew back home together. During the flight, Anthony and Matilda finally opened up about their terrifying experience to their friends, family, and anyone willing to listen. Their story quickly became the topic of conversation at every gathering, with people gasping in disbelief and others shrugging it off as mere superstition. Some advised them to visit a spiritual leader, while others joked about it being the price of being too frugal. Anthony, however, had learned his lesson. From then on, he never skimped on accommodations, always choosing the safest and most reputable places. Matilda, though still wary of strange places, was grateful that they had made it out together.